I watched a tank burn because the orders said it was already lost. Days later, I saw the same enemy tank roll past again, scarred but alive. My superiors called it attrition. The system called it necessary. I learned that day which losses stayed gone and which ones did not. By the summer of 1944, armored warfare in northwestern Europe had entered a phase defined as much by recovery and repair as by movement and fire. Following the Allied landings in Normandy on 6 June 1944, U.S. and British forces were advancing through a landscape shaped by hedgerows, narrow roads, and destroyed infrastructure. Combat was frequent, but often fragmented, and armored units on both sides faced high rates of mechanical breakdown and battle damage. Tanks disabled by mines, artillery fragments, thrown tracks, or engine failures were a routine feature of the battlefield. The German army, the Heer, had long operated under conditions where recovery of damaged tanks near the front was difficult and often impossible. German armored doctrine emphasized forward momentum, limited recovery assets, and the assumption that many damaged vehicles would be abandoned if not quickly repaired under fire. By 1944, fuel shortages, air interdiction, and the increasing dominance of Allied artillery further constrained German recovery efforts. German tank crews were accustomed to destroying their own disabled vehicles with explosives if retreat or repair was not feasible. In contrast, U.S. armored forces entered the European campaign with a different logistical and organizational structure. American armored divisions were supported by dedicated maintenance battalions, recovery companies, and a standardized system for battlefield repair and evacuation. This system was not flawless, but it was extensive, methodical, and increasingly visible as the campaign progressed beyond the Normandy beaches. The setting for these observations was the Bocage region of Normandy and later the open countryside of northern France during the breakout operations of July and August 1944. German armored units, including elements of Panzer Lehr Division and the 2nd Panzer Division, were engaged in defensive actions against U.S. First Army formations. Combat reports from both sides indicate frequent tank losses, but they also reveal an asymmetry in how damaged vehicles were handled after engagement. Among those observing this disparity was a German tank commander assigned to a Panzer IV unit operating west of Saint-Lô in July 1944. His role was not unusual. He commanded a small crew, followed orders transmitted through increasingly unreliable communication channels, and was responsible for maintaining his vehicle under difficult conditions. Like many German armored officers at this stage of the war, his daily concerns included fuel availability, spare parts, and the growing threat from Allied fighter bombers. From his position along secondary roads and improvised defensive lines, he began to notice a recurring pattern during and after engagements with American forces. U.S. tanks that appeared disabled during combat, sometimes visibly immobilized or partially damaged, were often not permanently lost. Instead, within hours or days, these vehicles would reappear in operational condition, sometimes in the same sector, sometimes further forward. At first, these observations were dismissed as coincidence. The American armored units fielded large numbers of tanks, and it was reasonable to assume replacements were being brought forward. However, closer attention revealed details that suggested something else was occurring. Vehicles bearing the same markings, distinctive damage scars, or improvised field modifications were seen again after having previously been knocked out or abandoned. German crews were familiar with battlefield recovery in theory. German armored units did possess recovery vehicles, such as the Panther or modified half-tracks. In practice, however, these assets were scarce, often immobilized themselves, and vulnerable to air attack. Recovery operations typically required secure rear areas and sufficient time, conditions rarely available in the fluid fighting of mid-1944. American recovery vehicles, by contrast, were becoming a regular sight. These included tank retrievers, heavy trucks equipped with winches, and armored recovery vehicles adapted from tank chassis. They operated under the protection of U.S. artillery and air superiority, which limited German interference. Recovery crews worked methodically, often at night or under smoke cover, extracting disabled tanks from ditches, fields, or roadsides. The German tank commander began to notice this activity during lulls in fighting. From concealed positions, his crew observed American recovery teams towing Sherman tanks away from forward areas. In some cases, the recovery vehicles operated surprisingly close to the front lines. The expectation that such vehicles would be easy targets did not always align with reality. Artillery coverage, rapid movement, and the absence of German air support reduced opportunities for effective interdiction. These observations were shared informally among German crews. Conversations during maintenance halts or in temporary assembly areas included remarks about American persistence in reclaiming vehicles that German crews would have already written off. There was no admiration expressed, but there was professional recognition of an effective system operating under fire. At the same time, limitations within the German system became increasingly apparent. German tanks damaged by relatively minor issues, thrown tracks, damaged optics, or jammed turrets, were often lost simply because recovery was impossible. Fuel shortages meant towing a disabled tank risked immobilizing the recovery vehicle itself. Air attacks made daytime recovery operations dangerous, and nighttime efforts were constrained by poor coordination and limited equipment. Official German doctrine still emphasized destruction of disabled vehicles to prevent capture. However, this approach increasingly conflicted with operational reality. Tanks were expensive, production was strained, and replacement rates could not keep pace with losses. The gap between doctrinal expectations and battlefield conditions widened as the campaign continued. Reports up the chain of command mentioned enemy logistical strength in general terms, but specific attention to recovery operations was limited. Intelligence summaries focused on enemy tank numbers, types, and deployment patterns, not on how many of those tanks had previously been damaged and returned to service. For the German tank commander and others like him, the operational problem was becoming clear through experience rather than formal analysis. The American armored force did not simply replace losses, it reduced them through recovery. This reduced the cumulative impact of German defensive fire and prolonged American operational endurance. By late July 1944, as Operation Cobra began and the U.S. breakout intensified, the pace of combat increased. German units were forced into rapid withdrawals, often abandoning equipment. Under these conditions, the contrast between American recovery capacity and German abandonment grew even more pronounced. These observations made during this period did not immediately alter German tactics or doctrine. They did, however, contribute to a growing awareness among frontline crews that the opposing force was operating under a fundamentally different logistical model, one that treated damaged tanks as temporary problems rather than permanent losses. The stage was set for further encounters that would test German assumptions about attrition, replacement, and the meaning of a knocked-out tank in modern armored warfare. By August 1944, the operational situation facing German armored units in northern France had deteriorated sharply. Following the success of Operation Cobra, U.S. forces broke through German defensive lines near Saint-Lô and began a rapid advance toward Avranches and beyond. German panzer units were committed piecemeal, often without adequate infantry or air support, and were forced into repeated delaying actions. Losses mounted quickly, not only from direct combat, but from breakdowns, fuel exhaustion, and abandonment during withdrawals. It was during this phase that the contrast in recovery practices became impossible for German crews to ignore. German tank units were now operating in near-continuous retreat. Positions were held briefly, then abandoned under pressure. Disabled tanks were frequently destroyed by their own crews using demolition charges, sometimes within sight of American forces. The act had become routine rather than exceptional. Crews no longer debated whether recovery might be possible; they assumed it was not. In contrast, American armored columns continued to advance with a consistency that raised questions. Despite encountering mines, anti-tank guns, and panzer counterattacks, U.S. tank formations did not appear to shrink at the rate German crews expected. Engagements that should have resulted in lasting reductions instead produced only temporary gaps. The German tank commander, now operating east of Coutances, witnessed several engagements in which U.S. Sherman tanks were disabled by German fire. In one instance, a Sherman was struck in the suspension by an anti-tank gun, throwing its track and immobilizing it in a shallow ditch. The crew bailed out under fire, and the position was later overrun by German infantry during a local counterattack. By all German measures, the tank was lost. 2 days later, during a withdrawal along the same road, the commander observed what appeared to be the same Sherman tank, identifiable by a distinctive welded spare track arrangement and faded tactical markings, moving under its own power as part of an American column. The damage had been repaired, and the vehicle was operational again. Such occurrences became frequent enough to provoke discussion beyond casual remarks. German non-commissioned officers began reporting that American tank losses were uncertain and that visual confirmation of destruction could no longer be assumed reliable. A tank disabled did not necessarily mean a tank removed from the enemy's order of battle. At the unit level, this had practical consequences. German anti-tank crews relied on limited ammunition stocks and carefully chosen firing positions. If disabled tanks were routinely recovered and returned, the effectiveness of these engagements was reduced in cumulative terms. German crews were expending resources for results that did not endure. Meanwhile, German recovery efforts continued to fail. Attempts to tow disabled tanks often ended with multiple vehicles stuck, out of fuel, or abandoned under air attack. Recovery vehicles were priority targets for Allied fighter bombers, and their loss further reduced German capacity. In some units, recovery assets existed only on paper. Doctrine offered little flexibility. Official guidance still emphasized destruction over capture, and reports requesting additional recovery equipment went unanswered. The assumption remained that battlefield conditions did not permit systematic recovery, rather than questioning whether that assumption itself was contributing to losses. American recovery operations, observed intermittently through binoculars or reported by reconnaissance patrols, appeared organized and deliberate. Recovery vehicles operated in teams, sometimes escorted by infantry or armored cars. Smoke was used. Operations were timed to periods of reduced German activity. Disabled tanks were winched, lifted, or towed with efficiency that suggested training and repetition rather than improvisation. The growing disparity created frustration among German crews. It was not expressed as anger, but as a recognition of imbalance. The German system treated tanks as expendable once disabled. The American system treated them as assets worth reclaiming, even under fire. By mid-August, during the fighting around the Falaise Pocket, German units were encircled or nearly so. The chaos of retreat left little opportunity for observation, but the pattern persisted. American armored strength appeared resilient despite constant engagement. For the German tank commander, the conclusion was forming gradually. The issue was not simply American numerical superiority, but the reduced permanence of American losses. German assumptions about attrition no longer matched battlefield reality. These realizations did not yet translate to action. There was no authority to alter doctrine, no equipment to change outcomes, and no time to experiment. The tension between what German crews were taught and what they observed continued to grow, unresolved and increasingly costly. By late August 1944, The remnants of several German armored units had withdrawn across the Seine. The retreat from Normandy had cost the German army thousands of vehicles, many destroyed not in combat, but abandoned for lack of fuel, recovery capability, or time. What remained of the panzer formations was reorganized hastily as they attempted to establish new defensive lines further east. It was during this period of reconstitution that observation turned into reluctant realization. The German tank commander, now attached to a provisional armored group operating in northeastern France, found himself temporarily removed from continuous combat. His unit was tasked with covering secondary routes and screening movements, rather than conducting direct counterattacks. This reduced tempo created moments for reflection and comparison, something rarely afforded during the chaos of the retreat. Reports from reconnaissance elements and intercepted radio traffic indicated that U.S. armored divisions advancing eastward were still fielding near full complements of tanks. This was despite weeks of intense fighting, frequent engagements with German rearguards, and persistent exposure to mines and artillery. Replacement shipments alone could not account for this consistency. More telling were direct observations made along roads recently vacated by American forces. German patrols encountered maintenance areas containing damaged U.S. tanks in various stages of repair. Some were missing tracks or had turret damage. Others bore clear signs of earlier battle damage that had been patched rather than replaced. These vehicles had not been sent back to distant depots. They were being repaired close to the front. In one such area, abandoned hurriedly due to German movement, recovery equipment was found intact: heavy winches, spare suspension components, welding gear, and standardized tool sets. The organization of the site suggested a planned recovery point rather than an improvised repair effort. Everything was arranged to return vehicles to service quickly. This evidence contradicted long-held German assumptions. The prevailing belief had been that modern armored warfare made forward repair impractical. Tanks, once disabled, were expected to be written off. Recovery was considered a secondary concern compared to production and replacement. The American system demonstrated that this belief was not universally valid. The turning point was not a single dramatic event, but an accumulation of confirmations. Disabled tanks were not disappearing from the battlefield permanently. They were circulating through a system designed to absorb damage and restore function. The German tank commander recognized that German firepower, while tactically effective, was strategically diluted by this process. This realization carried personal implications. Every engagement in which his crew disabled an enemy tank now carried uncertainty. Had the effort truly reduced enemy strength or merely delayed it? The psychological effect of knocking out a tank, a visible marker of success, was undermined when the same vehicle returned days later. At the same time, German losses remained absolute. A German tank disabled was almost certainly gone for good. Crews evacuated, destroyed the vehicle if possible, and moved on foot. There was no expectation of seeing it again. The imbalance was no longer abstract. It was measurable in the shrinking size of German units and the sustained pressure applied by American armored formations. German crews were operating with the knowledge that their own margin for error was effectively zero, while their opponents' was not. This growing awareness did not lead to an official change in doctrine. There was no directive ordering increased recovery efforts or reallocating resources. Fuel shortages alone made such changes impractical. However, at the crew level, attitudes began to shift. German tank commanders became more cautious about abandoning vehicles prematurely. In rare cases, crews attempted limited recovery under cover of darkness, even when doctrine discouraged it. These efforts were usually unsuccessful. Without proper equipment or protection, they often resulted in additional losses.
Still, they reflected a quiet adjustment in thinking, the acceptance that the old assumptions no longer held. For the German tank commander, the risk became personal. Remaining with a damaged vehicle longer than prescribed exposed his crew to artillery fire, air attack, and encirclement. Leaving too early meant certain loss of the tank. The decision was no longer purely procedural, it required judgment under pressure. By early September 1944, as German forces attempted to stabilize their lines along the West Wall, the consequences of these systemic differences were clear to those at the front. American armored strength remained resilient, German armored strength did not. The realization had arrived too late to alter the immediate course of events, but it reshaped how experienced crews understood the battlefield they were fighting on.
By September 1944, German armored units along the Western Front were operating under conditions of persistent scarcity. Fuel allocations were minimal, spare parts were irregular, and replacement crews arrived with limited training. The West Wall, which German command hoped would stabilize the front, offered defensive terrain but did not resolve the deeper structural problems facing the armored force. For experienced tank crews, the disparity in recovery capability had moved beyond observation and realization. It now shaped daily decisions and carried consequences that extended beyond the battlefield. Within German units, informal adjustments had begun to clash with official expectations. Tank commanders, aware that abandoning a damaged vehicle almost certainly meant permanent loss, occasionally delayed demolition orders. Crews attempted to assess whether limited repairs could be made on the spot, realigning a thrown track, clearing a jammed turret ring, or restarting an overheated engine. These efforts were conducted quietly and without formal approval. Such actions carried risk. German regulations emphasized rapid denial of equipment to the enemy. Delays could be interpreted as hesitation or disobedience. Commanders were under pressure to maintain discipline during a period when cohesion was already fragile. The German tank commander who had followed the campaign from Normandy now faced these dilemmas repeatedly. During a defensive engagement near the German border, his Panzer IV was damaged by artillery fragments that disabled its radio and partially jammed the turret traverse. The vehicle was still mobile, but its combat effectiveness was reduced. Doctrine suggested withdrawal and destruction if repair was uncertain. Instead, he ordered the crew to remain under cover while attempting field repairs. The decision was not framed as defiance, but as necessity. Fuel was scarce, replacements unlikely, and the tank represented one of the few remaining operational vehicles in the sector. The repairs were incomplete, the radio could not be restored, and the turret movement remained limited. When the unit was later ordered to reposition, the damaged tank lagged behind, vulnerable and isolated. Eventually, under threat of encirclement, the crew abandoned and destroyed it. The effort had delayed loss, but not prevented it. This pattern repeated across multiple units. Attempts to preserve armored strength at the margin resulted in mixed outcomes. Some vehicles were recovered short distances and repaired enough to remain operational for days or weeks. Others were lost after exposing crews to additional danger. The absence of a systematic recovery infrastructure meant these decisions were improvised and uneven. Higher command was aware of the attrition problem, but framed it in terms of enemy superiority rather than internal limitation. Reports cited Allied air power, numerical advantage, and fuel shortages. The role of recovery and repair was rarely emphasized as a central factor. When concerns were raised, they were met with structural constraints. Recovery vehicles required fuel and protection that could not be spared. Concentrating damaged tanks for repair risked detection and destruction. The system could not support widespread change, even if the need was acknowledged. Meanwhile, American recovery operations continued to function despite advancing into contested terrain. German units reported U.S. recovery vehicles operating under artillery cover, with coordination between combat and support elements that German forces could no longer match. The difference was not only material, but organizational. For German crews, the psychological impact was significant. Every engagement carried a sense of imbalance. Success was measured in temporary delays rather than lasting results. Losses felt cumulative and irreversible. The German tank commander noted that morale suffered not from fear alone, but from the perception of inefficiency. Crews felt their efforts were expended into a system that could not preserve their gains. The knowledge that enemy tanks might return while theirs would not altered how crews assessed risk and reward. This tension extended upward. Junior officers quietly questioned whether adherence to doctrine served its intended purpose under current conditions. Senior officers, constrained by orders and resources, could offer no alternative. By late autumn 1944, the disparity had become an accepted reality rather than a problem to be solved. German armored units adapted by lowering expectations, conserving what equipment remained, and focusing on delay rather than attrition. The consequences of earlier decisions, organizational, doctrinal, and logistical, were now unavoidable. The recovery gap did not decide battles on its own, but it shaped the endurance of forces over time. As winter approached, German armored strength in the West was a fraction of what it had been months earlier. The realization that some losses might have been mitigated came without the means to act on it. By the winter of 1944-1945, the consequences of the disparity in recovery capability were no longer matters of perception or debate. They were reflected in unit strength reports, maintenance logs, and the reduced operational reach of German armored formations along the Western Front. German armored units entering the Ardennes offensive in December 1944 did so with sharply limited reserves. Many tanks committed to the operation had already undergone multiple repairs, often conducted under substandard conditions. Recovery assets remained scarce, fuel allocations were tightly rationed, and the margin for mechanical failure was minimal. A tank disabled during the offensive was unlikely to be recovered, particularly once Allied air power reasserted itself after the initial days of poor weather. American armored units, facing their own losses during the fighting, continued to apply the same recovery principles observed earlier in the campaign. U.S. after-action reports from the Ardennes indicate that a significant portion of damaged tanks were retrieved, repaired, and returned to service within days or weeks. Even in the harsh winter conditions, recovery teams operated systematically, supported by established logistics and repair networks extending from forward maintenance areas to rear depots. For German crews, the contrast had become routine rather than surprising. The German tank commander who had observed these patterns since Normandy survived the war, eventually surrendering in the spring of 1945 after his unit was rendered non-operational due to lack of fuel and vehicles. His final combat reports contained no dramatic conclusions. They documented shortages, abandoned equipment, and the steady reduction of combat-ready tanks. In post-war interrogations and memoirs, German armored officers frequently emphasized Allied air superiority and numerical strength. Less often highlighted, but consistently present in technical assessments, was the issue of recovery and repair. German analysts reviewing the campaign acknowledged that American forces treated damaged tanks as recoverable assets, while German forces treated them as expendable once disabled. This difference was not rooted in individual courage or technical skill. German tank crews were experienced, disciplined, and capable. The disparity lay in organizational priorities established long before the campaign began. German armored doctrine had evolved under assumptions of rapid, decisive operations and limited logistical depth. When those assumptions no longer applied, the system struggled to adapt. The U.S. Army's approach reflected a different institutional mindset. Standardization, redundancy, and recovery were integrated into planning and training. Recovery vehicles were produced in large numbers, crews were trained specifically for retrieval under fire, and command structures accounted for the time and resources required to return damaged equipment to service. The effect of this approach was cumulative rather than dramatic. It did not guarantee victory in individual engagements, but it reduced long-term attrition. A tank that returned to service represented preserved crew experience, conserved production capacity, and sustained operational tempo. In the aftermath of the war, these lessons influenced post-war armored doctrine on both sides of the emerging Cold War divide. Armies reassessed the balance between replacement and recovery vehicles became standard components of armored formations. The idea that a disabled tank was not necessarily a lost tank gained institutional acceptance. For the German tank commander and many like him, the realization came too late to alter their circumstances. Their experience did not produce an immediate doctrinal shift during the war, but it contributed to the historical understanding of why German armored forces declined more rapidly than production figures alone would suggest. The story of recovery vehicles rarely appears in accounts of major battles. They did not engage enemy armor directly or capture territory. Their work was conducted behind the line of contact, often under fire but without recognition. Yet their presence altered the balance of endurance on the battlefield. In the quiet arithmetic of war, vehicles lost versus vehicles returned, the American recovery system reduced the permanence of damage. German crews, operating without comparable support, felt the weight of every loss. This difference, observed by those who faced it firsthand, became part of the understated mechanics that shaped the final year of the war in Europe.